Welcome to the event. Let's talk about corporations, a new series of boardroom conversations. And my name is Simon Bronnett. I'm the Dean of Sydney Law School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. First things first, acknowledge our First Nations people. And I am delighted that, so you can see me, thank you, Carla. I'm delighted and honoured to offer the acknowledgement of country, to pay respects to our Gadigal people. The Gadigal are named after the Gadi trees, which in fact there are 3 at the back there, 130 years old, as I point out often. They're the same age as the law school. If you wonder what so they take their name from Gadi plants, trees, and Gadigal means the people of the Gadi. And I pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge any First Nations people here joining us in person and online. So what's all this about? Well, the genesis for this is, I suppose, something that came about during lockdown. And wanting to connect colleagues, former colleagues of mine from UQ in the TC Byrne School of Law, where I was before I came down to Sydney, and really think about something that our strategic plan, Reimagining Sydney Law School, had identified as the need to do more with industry, do more with the profession. Our law school, of course, was downtown for over 100 years. And for the last 10, we've been here on this beautiful part of Sydney campus in a brand new building, now 10 years old. And our aspiration was to start a series of conversations about corporate integrity, corporate wrongdoing, but to do it not just simply in an academic frame. There's certainly plenty of colleagues, both here and at UQ, who have spent the bulk of their career thinking about corporate regulation and integrity. And, you know, when I joined UQ Business School, Business Economics and Law faculty, I knew nothing really about corporate liability, but I felt since I was joining a business group, I better find something about it. So for the last really 10 years, I've been thinking about anti-corruption, transnational crime and corruption, particularly around corporations. And I should say, I've just back from India, where I was there for 2.5 weeks teaching a course on integrity in global business transactions, comparatively examining India and Australia. So, and Rebecca Wallace, and I must acknowledge the co-convener of the program, a lecturer at TC Byrne, TCB as we call it, in UQ. She'll explain more about the series that we're trying to develop here. But I'm really delighted that we were able to secure Rod Sims to really kick off the series, and I suppose in some senses to give us a framework for thinking about corporate regulation. So this has been a lockdown project that's taken a year, and I see many of our collaborators and future presenters, discussants in the audience and online. And I'm so delighted we've been finally able to get together in person to begin these conversations. So let me tell you, I mean, one should say you don't need to give someone like Rod an introduction, but I'll give a short one. He is now, Rod Sims AO, is now a professor at Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU in Canberra. And of course, I was at ANU Faculty of Law for 20 years before I went to Queensland. So I know it very well, and the Crawford School is amazing. And of course, as we know, he has an extraordinary curriculum vitae in relation to corporate regulation. Probably, of course, for the decade that he served as the chair of the ACCC. But he's also got a global career, and now he's been released from the ACCC. He's obviously able to pursue more of that global work in regulation. And he's the chair of the Competition Research Policy Network at the Centre for Economic Policy Research in Paris, not Texas, Paris, France. He is the chair of Opera Australia as well. And I think, obviously, before taking the critical role of leadership in the ACCC, had a range of senior corporate and public sector positions, including serving as the principal economic advisor to Bob Hawke. So really, we couldn't get a better presenter to give us a framework for our series of conversations. So just so you know the format, drinks after, that's probably the most important thing, bit of networking. But there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. And we don't want to forget our online people. And so please, online participants, feel free to use the chat. We won't forget you. And if you have questions at the end, please drop them in there, and we'll make sure that we relay them to our keynote speaker. So with that, I will hand over the podium, lectern to Rod. Thank you very much.
Now, is this working all right? It is. Okay, excellent. Well, look, my apologies for running a little late. I blame the traffic, and the only reason we got here as quickly as we did is my wife actually works here, so she knew the most efficient way to get here and the efficient way to get up the building. But look, I'd like to thank Sydney University and the University of Queensland, and obviously Professor Simon Bronnett and Dr. Rebecca Wallace for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm a great fan of projects like the one you're doing, so and I'll explain a little bit why later. Now, obviously, I suspect my 11 years at the ACCC was the reason you've asked me to speak tonight, so it won't surprise you if I do talk a fair bit about competition and consumers. But whatever your background or interest in this topic, I think the framework I'll try and give, I think, is really fundamental to the role corporations play in our market economy. I'm going to make 5 points tonight, which is more than my usual, but I will try and provide a bit of a wider framework in which I think we must see corporations and which I think is relevant to the project being launched. I want to make the point that companies clearly do not always have the best interests of their customers in mind. I want to make the point that the corporate structure itself changes individual behaviour. Also make the point that there are some changes that we need to improve the behaviour of corporations. And then I'll talk about a little bit about academic work and public policy. Onto that wider framework. The moral philosopher Adam Smith famously said over 200 years ago, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. This is perhaps the most meaningful quote in economics, believe it or not, and perhaps the most misused. It's the basis for Adam Smith's invisible hand of market forces that can keep the economy running well. Smith was clearly in favour of market forces guiding decisions on, say, where to invest, and not having government do that. Some think this means that Smith was advocating for governments not intervening in a market economy in any way at all. That's not right. As chair of the ACCC, I once gave a speech at the Institute of Public Affairs. I was met at the door by the convener of the session, who said he's a real adherent to Adam Smith and believes the ACCC shouldn't exist at all, which was a great way to start the evening. I did explain, though, that Smith in his writings was clear that market forces and price signals Indeed, his invisible hand cannot bring the desired or expected outcomes without companies facing competition. It's really a much missed point. And it's a key role of government, in Smith's view, to ensure we have that competition. I mean, if there's only 2 bakers in town, if you don't have enough competition, your dinner's going to be expensive and it's going to be lousy. It is, I think, also not much understood that the essence of well-accepted corporate strategy, theory and practice is for companies to seek and gain market power. Profits from outrunning, outcompeting your competitors by simply aiming for better products or servicing them better are usually small and temporary, as price rises are set by the market and by the forces of competition. Alternatively, profits from exercising market power are, of course, large and continuing because you have price freedom. You can price above a competitive level with that market power. In Michael Porter's famous, he's the sort of guru of corporate strategy, Michael Porter, he wrote in 1979 and a lot more after that, but this really clear, eloquent article, he described how companies generally actively seek market power through lowering competition, raising entry barriers to would-be competitors, or gaining some continuing hold over consumers. And of course, when companies have that market power, in Porter's view, in the view of corporate strategy, you've got to do what you can to keep that market power. None of this is controversial in the corporate world. It seems to be controversial outside, but if you're talking amongst corporate people, they'd say, well, of course, you've just said it's daylight out there. I mean, tell me something I don't know. Now, Warren Buffett, that famous investor, has repeatedly said, he says it all the time, he only invests in companies that have moats around them. He means companies that are in significant ways protected from competition. This is logical. He wants to invest in companies that continually achieve high rates of return. And of course, he's been very successful in achieving that. So company actions and objectives are therefore at odds with the approaches and objectives of antitrust, competition law, but also, I think, good public policy. This is important. When companies seek to lower competition by, say, a merger or blocking competitors, this isn't an accident. It's what they're actively seeking to do because it's the way towards higher profitability. Some believe, and I've heard this said by many people in the public sector, seriously, that businesses only, and I emphasize only, that businesses only succeed by looking after the interests of their customers. This is naive, and it ignores particularly the issues to do with market power. Companies, of course, must have regard to their customers. I'm not saying they ignore them, but the level of attention they'll give to their customers depends a lot on the degree of market power that they've got. All business people know that when the number of competitors get too large, then price competition is often a result, and you'll hear them say, and you can read it in new business pages, this will destroy shareholder value. What they mean is it will help consumers. They're the mirror image of the same thing. With a small number of stable competitors, each company is aware that price competition will simply lower prices across the board because you know that the other companies will respond, and so prices stay high and stable, and you don't want more than a number of competitors, otherwise you'll interrupt that process. New entrants, for example, will seek to grow share by lowering prices or through product innovation, so they must either be kept out by the existing players, by raising entry barriers or made difficult for them, or they get acquired. There are many forces and policies that promote, there are many forces against policies that promote competition. Business and business organisations, and often business media. Progress in improving competition in our economy is therefore like walking up the down escalator. Unless you're constantly pressing forward, competition is going to go backwards. I'll just give two, I think, really important quotes. One's from Thomas Folletti, who's a world-renowned economist in this field. He said, "Our industries have become increasingly concentrated over the last 30 years. Margins, the ability of firms to set price above costs, have been going up starting in the 1980s. Innovation is also more difficult than in the past. Firms leave the market, they still die, but they're not born at the same rate. The downside of these margins and profits ending up in fewer and fewer hands is that the workforce's share of GDP gets smaller. So money is being made, but not trickling down in a uniform way, which perhaps also drives inequality. I think you could say exactly the same thing about Australia. In the introduction to a 2019 book, Martin Wolf, who's the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times and a world-respected commentator on things economic, very widely respected, said, slowing growth and rising inequality have become a toxic combination in Western economies. This combination threatens the survival of liberal democracy itself. Why has this happened? And this is his key point. Some blame an excess of free market capitalism, but the precise opposite is the case. What has emerged over the last 40 years is not free market capitalism, but a predatory form of monopoly capitalism. Capitalists will, alas, always prefer monopoly. Of course, you all would if you were running a business. But only the state can restore the competition that we need. Really, this is the essence of what Smith was saying as well. Far from the invisible hand suggesting the government should not intervene in the marketplace, there's a crucial role for government to promote competition. As Wolf said, our liberal democracies are under threat from the consequences of a lack of competition, particularly that the benefits from capitalism are not being properly shared. Now, the challenge, I think, is real. More concerning in the US than here by a long way, but still real here too. Peter Thiel, the co-founder of both PayPal and Palantir Technologies, has said, quote, I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. What he was talking about was economic freedom or capitalism with little or no government role. He realises that the populace will not accept the consequences of what he was proposing, which is particularly going to be income inequality. So faced with a choice between his preferred form of capitalism and democracy, he seems he would go with capitalism and discard democracy. And there's a whole running debate on this in the United States, has been going for a number of years. Peter Thiel's at the extreme, but he's not alone. Now, it must be said that encouraging people to pursue their self-interest is not, necessarily the obvious way to run an economy, but it works as it creates prosperity. It will only be able to do this in a democracy, however, if the wealth is reasonably evenly divided. Some who want to keep wealth unequal have realised that democracy can no longer serve their interest. Now, I quite embrace capitalism. I think it generates prosperity and I think it can do other things. Our standard of living is due to the capitalist economy we've had over the last couple of hundred years. But it must come with rules that ensure competition, and there must be policies to distribute the wealth created. Now, many applaud the Hawke and Keating pro-competition market reforms of the 80s, but they forget the massive accompanying social reforms, largely driven by Deputy Prime Minister Brian Howe, that had a considerable effect on improving income inequality. During that period, productivity growth went up a lot, prosperity increased, and income inequality reduced. We became a lot more equal society. This successful reform combination should never be forgotten. We should also harness the power of incentives and innovation to solve significant problems. For example, a carbon tax would do wonders for harnessing capitalism to tackle climate change. ESG norms will not get us there. You can't expect companies to do what is not in their interest. That's a topic for another day, but happy to come back and talk about that. I've provided this background because I think we do need to talk about corporations, and we do need to, I think, bring that understanding to the discussion. Now, my second topic about companies do not always have the interests of customers in mind. And this is sort of me now returning to earth with some more practical points. At the ACCC, we saw a lot of behaviour to reduce competition through mergers and raising entry barriers. Now, Google is a very interesting case. It innovated its way to success through a superior search engine, but then cemented its market power through numerous acquisitions. Think Android, DoubleClick, YouTube, and so on. It's done a lot of self-preferencing of its own products. There's a lot of potentially anti-competitive agreements, and it's got 94% now of our search market. Have you noticed the number of paid search results you get on Google versus organic search results? I think there is a difference now that they've got a well-cemented monopoly. Now, Google has an advertising-based business model, and so its profits depend on using the enormous data it has on you to influence what and how frequently you buy things. I thought tonight I'd just briefly mention some of the ACCC cases. I could go on forever, but if you ever want to have a bit of amusement, just go and look at the ACCC media releases, particularly over the last 10 years. They were the best ones. The federal court, for example, found that food manufacturer Heinz had made misleading claims that Little Kids Shreds products were beneficial for young children when they contained approximately 2/3 sugar. We had Nurofen with its specific pain products. They represented that each of these specific pain products was there formulated to treat a particular type of pain, when in fact the active ingredient was the same as their general products. The only difference was the specific pain products cost you twice as much as the regular products. We then had Meriton, who, when they thought somebody might give them a lousy review, stuck a little extra thing behind their email address so that they actually never got the review to actually put the review on TripAdvisor, thinking that that person would give them a lousy review. So they made sure TripAdvisor never got the email. Lorna Jane was charged with claiming its antivirus activewear, which was sprayed with a substance called LJ Shield, eliminated and stopped the spread of COVID-19, which I thought was particularly interesting. It was about 2 years ago. Trivago misled its customers that its sites allowed them to get the best deal, when in fact it often presented them with the deal that best rewarded Trivago. Oscar Wiley made statements that for each pair of glasses bought, it would donate a pair to someone in need, when in fact that was rarely the case. And of course, who could forget VW misleading statements to its customers and regulators that its diesel vehicles complied with emission standards when they had two modes of operation, one that did comply when it was in a factory, the other one that didn't when it was actually on the open road. Very clever, completely illegal, driven from the top, stunning behaviour for a company to do. And then we had Telstra branded stores selling goods to Indigenous people up north that they could not understand, could not afford. Dreadful. So I could go on, but this list includes well-known companies. These companies regularly proclaim that they put their customer interest first, but I think customers hearing this are right to think that companies are sometimes a bit hypocritical, and it can make them question whether the economy works for them. So let me just look now at thinking about the question that's always asked, I think, when we have improper behaviour: why is this happening? Well, as I've already indicated, meeting customer needs may not be the main way companies succeed. Indeed, I think it's more often the pursuit of market power. Being the best at meeting the needs of consumers is not always, or as I say, the dominant way of succeeding. Staying ahead of rivals through continual improvement is a difficult task for most companies. Eventually, someone works out how to do things better and cheaper. So, as I say, commercial strategy is generally about building defences against competition, and that's where a lot of the focus goes. Then we've got the issue about company executives under pressure to grow short-term profits. Many companies set very high profit growth targets. Often these targets in percentage terms are higher than real GDP growth. And obviously not all firms can do that. So they're setting themselves targets that collectively they all can't do. So some are going to make it, some are not, but they're under tremendous pressure to meet those targets. Then you get the race to the bottom. This is where the behaviour I've described not just damages consumers, but of course it damages the competitors. If you're gaining market share by misleading consumers, you're not only misleading them, but you're taking share away from companies that aren't misleading consumers. If that behaviour doesn't get addressed, then others will copy it. And then, of course, you've got the issue of financial incentives. That's where people are rewarded for how many sales, achieving sales targets, profit targets. But often companies don't check how those targets are being met. So they set the targets, they reward people, but they're not checking by what means people are meeting the targets. And so this can drive very bad behaviour indeed. I used to see corporate executives in companies that had these financial incentive schemes. We found out they were doing dreadful things to consumers. You'd confront the CEO with this and the CEO would be surprised. And I'm just sitting there saying, why are you surprised? You gave them an incentive to do this. You didn't check how they did it. You just paid them according to achieving the result. If you're not checking how they're doing it, you're at fault. And if you're surprised by that, welcome to the real world. The only other point I want to make there is that I think sometimes company loyalty is extremely strong. It often appears as if company executives behave differently when they're at work than they would privately. Often it appears they feel their obligation to the company compels them to do things in the company's name that they wouldn't do if they were running their own business. And I see that quite a lot in discussions with people, that they have a mindset change when they walk through the corporate door. Now, what can we do about this with companies behaving badly? Well, that's your job to sort that out. But I couldn't resist leaving you with a few suggestions. And people may not be surprised by these, but first, I do think we need much stronger merger laws to help the ACCC prevent anti-competitive mergers. The courts require evidence about what will happen after a merger has occurred. But it's hard to prove what hasn't happened. The courts seem largely unwilling to accept what I would define as commercial logic, that if you have market power, you'll use it. So again, my sense is sometimes courts can appear commercially naive. The second change is to introduce, and I should just add, I outlined some preferred changes to merger laws in a speech I gave back in August 2021. Second, we need a law against unfair practices, which is what they've got in the US, the UK, and Europe. Such laws can curb the worst abuses of market power affecting consumers. Our current laws are poorly suited, for example, to stopping behaviour ranging from online manipulation of consumers to processors in the agricultural sector saying they'll reject farm goods unless the price agreed before the goods were shipped are then lowered. A whole lot of behaviour we just cannot get at and no other laws can get at. So I think an unfair practices provision would be extremely helpful. And look, I think my third thing is where market power is so entrenched, we need more upfront sector-specific rules. We had those, for example, I mean, this is not unusual. We had them in telecommunications and we had them for many years. And that's the only reason Telstra's monopoly on telecommunications was broken, because of the pro-competitive upfront rules set by the ACCC. And I think we should do the same with digital platforms. The ACCC has recommendations before the government that I hope they pick up. In addition to these three changes, though, I'd urge that when targeting corporate wrongdoing, focus on the company. That is key. If wrongdoing only sees the individual who actually did it at the final stage, targeted, then the company is just going to blame that bad apple and won't have any reason to address the problem. And usually it's poor company incentives or systems that allowed bad behaviour to occur. So if what we're doing in dealing with corporate behaviour is tackling the individual, you're not going to solve the problem. You've got to tackle the company. They're working for the company. The company has to have systems in place. My financial incentives example, I think, is a good one. We found that in the electricity sector. We took all three major electricity companies to court. They had door-to-door sellers. They employed a firm to do the door-to-door selling, who then hired another firm of door knockers, who then hired people off the street to do the door knocking. At each level, they got paid for the sales they made. We didn't contemplate taking action against the people who did dreadful things when they went door to door. We took the companies to court. They set up the system. They didn't police it. It's their fault. Had we taken action against the individuals, there would have been no change. In the end, door-to-door selling stopped. So just finally, I do applaud the initiative being launched tonight. I really do believe that academic work needs to be much more deeply involved in helping address public policy problems. There's a wealth of knowledge in academia to do that. In economics, for example, academic success often involves getting articles into a small number of largely overseas journals, clearly advancing in some way some theoretical model or debate in a really, really clever way, don't get me wrong. But there isn't the recognition in academic success, at least in economics, I won't speak about law, of people who help and formulate public policy. That does not seem to get the same recognition in terms of career advancement. Now, as Simon mentioned, I do chair this organisation in Paris, and its whole existence is just to do this, to bring academics, public policy people together, or in this case, academics and antitrust people, so that we can get more academic focus on antitrust issues. So I wish the project you're launching tonight every success, and thank you for allowing me to pontificate on issues I feel very strongly about. So thank you. Do I stay here or do I go? Oh, okay. Yes.
Thank you. I think that's working. Hi. Thank you very much for such a stimulating conversation, and I think a really, really good beginning to what we're hoping to build over the next 12 to 18 months. So I'm Dr. Rebecca Wallace from the School of Law at the University of Queensland, and I have some colleagues with me here today. So thank you for making the effort to come to Queensland, and some, of course, online as well. And we're really looking forward to being able to forge this relationship, I think, both within the university and with the broader, lots of broader stakeholders. So both within the legal profession, within corporations, and hopefully also with regulators. So thank you for all of you who have come here today who represent a number of those different stakeholders. But I think you've really set out a very broad and interesting set of questions that, hopefully we can begin to unpick in this process. And I'd really like to invite any questions from the floor here in person first, and then we'll see whether there have been some comments online as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. But my question is do you have any knowledge of anybody in the world who's applying the Eleanor Ostrom's design principles to control markets without markets or state? She had those design principles, or do you think the Nobel Prize Committee got it wrong by giving her a prize for her research that showed for thousands of years people have solved economic problems without markets or state with polycentric governance?
Well, I suppose they did, but if I understand you correctly, I mean, the last couple of 100 years is when we've had the prosperity and when we've had very much so our economy is run by market forces largely. So I think there is the value of a market economy is I think there. It's a matter of how we control it and make sure it doesn't get out of control. But I do understand the risks.
Can you answer my question?
Do you know anybody who's tried her design principles for avoiding markets and state to control competition?
Sorry, do I know anybody who?
Tried her design principles.
I'm not aware of the design principles.
That's the
yeah.
problem. It's the political science discipline, which economists apparently don't recognize.
I'm happy to recognise. I just haven't read it. Yeah.
So it's a way of solving the problems without markets or state. And it happens frequently in sporting organizations. They compete and cooperate without markets or state.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think sport is a very interesting combination where you could argue the sports are competing one sport against the other, and the way they do that is to get close competition, and the way they do that is to rig the market to help the little guy get back up the top, so that you get tighter contests. But look, happy to pick it up later, but I'm not too aware. My apologies.
So my name is Yana Svetiev. I'm from the University of Sydney Law School. And I guess I was wondering whether, the various examples that you made, whether they could be in a way synthesized so that, people agree with your diagnosis, but might think that competition is part of the problem rather than the solution. So, there is a book by economists, Akerlof and Schiller. It's called Fishing for Fools. And, they, like you, say, actually serving your customers better is not always the best way to make profits. It's actually about, manipulating them and kind of, playing on their biases. And in fact, often it will be competition that, then takes companies towards taking these sorts of strategies as a way of making profits. So in a way, competition can actually drive you towards these kind of strategies rather than preventing them. And another set of examples comes from the post-World War II period, where actually governments often ended up nationalizing certain industries in order to create monopolies that serve the public interest. So that also carries a different, type of, solution to these problems. So what do you think? Do you think that it's, necessarily competition, or that sometimes maybe kind of recognizing that, the limits of competitive markets, you just have to realize that some degree of coordination might be beneficial?
Oh, look, I think clearly there are times when you must have natural monopolies, which is not what you're saying, I realise. But when you've got poles and wires running down the street and you've got one NBN, I think they're different issues. You can't have competition there. But look, beyond that, I think that if you don't have competition as the regulator of markets, then what is the regulator of markets? Trusting companies, sorry? Well, but I mean, you can give, how do you, giving customers power still, I think, has to come through some framework where customers are empowered and that's enforced. Yeah, look, exceptions to rules, but I don't think those rules, I don't think the exceptions help us understand how best to run these economies. I think that, yes, the companies are misleading consumers to get better profits, but in a sense, they're trying to thwart competition by doing that. I think the more we get people competing on a level playing field, the more we get competition, the more we have clear rules around what they can do with consumers and not, we'll get the better outcomes. And look, I focused a lot on the negatives here, but we really do need to understand that there's a lot of goods we have that, whether it's the cars we drive, the food we buy, that actually works out pretty well. So it's not as if we're getting completely smashed by this dreadful system. It's improved our living standards massively, demonstratively over the last 200 years. My worry now is that we've got to a point in capitalist evolution that we may lose the game if we don't make sure we get competition and we don't address the worst excesses of inequality.
Hi, Professor Sims. Thank you for your talk. That was very illuminating. My name is Swapnik. I'm a student at the law school here. I'd be interested in hearing some of your thoughts about sort of the renaissance, I guess, of neo-Brandeisian thought in the US in antitrust policy, particularly through people like Lena Khan at the FTC. But there's a big intellectual movement around her. But a lot of what you said today seems to echo the idea that the problems of excessive monopoly are not just limited to price effects in the way that I guess the consumer welfare standard and sort of the Chicago school way of thinking about things conceptualizes, but there are also broader institutional, political, democratic problems with excessive centralization. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that generally.
I mean, if the neo-Brandeisians are there and the Chicago school's there, I'm sort of here somewhere, which doesn't help those people perhaps on the video. But just to elaborate, so I've got a lot of time for what Lena Khan is saying. So just for those who aren't familiar with the debate, the original antitrust was dealing with companies getting very large, having a lot of market power and just dealing with the market power. And trying to, so that's why you had the breakups of big oil and a whole lot of other things. In 1980 or so, or earlier perhaps, there was a Chicago movement, consumer welfare standard. What that meant was to establish a breach of competition law, you had to show that consumers were damaged in some particular way. You had, and usually that was price increases. What the new movement is doing is stepping back and very much saying, I guess, two things. One, if you're really interfering with the process of competition, that's a problem. You don't have to show what the consequence is. You know, if you're stopping your competitor compete, why bother spending a lot of time in the courtroom showing, well, you've stopped them competing. Now what was going to happen down the track? As a result of that, how do I show a price increase? No, they stopped their competitor competing, bang, you're gone. And that's what I've got a lot of attraction for, because I think the courts really struggle to handle showing consumer harm. It's just really difficult to do, and no regard is paid at the moment to interfering with the process of competition. The other part of the movement is just not wanting companies to get too big and too powerful, because then they influence politics, they donate, which we see all today's newspapers. And so that's, I think, trickier territory. But I'd much rather we just deal with companies interfering with the process of competition rather than this massive evidentiary burden, which makes competition law all around the world very hard to implement. So I think that has to change. And Lena Khan, at the ripe old age of 32, is leading the charge, which is incredibly impressive.
Good evening, Professor Sims. My name is Andy Schmuller. I'm a professor in the law school at Wollongong University. My focus isn't on competition as such, but on regulator efficacy. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts on regulatory capture. How serious a problem you think it is, and what steps you might have taken while you were at the ACCC to mitigate it. And I'd also like to pick up on something you said at the beginning about failings in the Anglo-American corporate governance model. And I'm just wondering if you have any knowledge of and thoughts on the German system of co-determination.
I'll deal with the second one quickly because I don't really have much to add on the German system. I'm aware of the debate, don't get me wrong. I don't think I've got any particular thing to add. I haven't sort of studied it enough and reached a conclusion that I think would be worth passing on. It would be sort of speculation. Regulatory capture is clearly an issue because, of course, the regulators interact with particular parties. The advantage the ACCC had is it regulates every company in every sector. So it's only really dealing with a company when it goes and clobbers them and hangs them from the yard arm in the city square. That's usually the limit. More sector-specific regulators are constantly dealing with the same people, and it's a lot harder. So we didn't really, I mean, I'm biased, of course, but I don't think we had the problem because we just weren't continually interacting with anybody, really. We were just there, dealing with all sorts of sectors. But it does have to be watched, particularly with sector-specific regulators. And I think the way regulators get respect, and what I would say to any regulator is you've got to be seen, you've got to be feared. If the sector doesn't fear you, you're failing. If the sector thinks you're doing a great job, I'd start to worry.
So I think we've got 4 questions online. The first one is from Jeremy Leith. He says, keen to hear Professor Sim's views on criminalising corporate conduct and the practical difficulties for a regulator.
And sorry, the last bit?
Practical difficulties for a regulator.
Yeah, well, look, our cartel laws are criminalised, and a very wise judge recently said they're a complete maze and difficult to implement. And as I'm sure this audience knows, when we're pursuing cases civilly, we're just dealing with the balance of probability. When we're doing cases criminally, it's beyond reasonable doubt. So, you know, I went through my first criminal case and listened to the judge give the instructions to the jury, and what the jury had to believe to find the company guilty was just, I thought, oh no, we're in trouble here. So it is difficult. That said, having the ability to send people to jail does focus the corporate mind massively. So I'm quite happy with our criminal cartel provisions, but I suspect if I were having my time again, we'd probably mainly take civil cases and now and again take a criminal one just to remind people that you can go to jail. So it's very difficult.
So the next question is from Jason Harris. I believe the first part of his question may have been answered during the talk, but I'll read it out. So he says, is one problem with this behaviour that large businesses can treat legal action by regulators as simply the cost of doing business? Do we need more personal actions against the people making the decisions and implementation of the ALRC systematic liability recommendation? Do we need more significant penalties actually being imposed by the courts? So he posted again to say that answers the first part of my question, but I do suggest further consideration of individual liability, as we see in OHS, would help focus the mind of the decision makers on the ground rather than assuming fixing the problem will be someone else's problem within the organisation.
Look, let me answer the first part, and then I'm not quite sure I fully got the second bit, but it's rather amusing from my point of view. When I started at the ACCC, a really good penalty under our consumer law was $1 million. And we pushed really hard to get high penalties. And then we managed to get 150 against VW and 125 against VW, 50 million against Telstra. So we really achieved a lot. And my proudest achievement at the ACCC was I got the government to increase penalties for consumer law breaches to the highest in the world by a long way. $10 million or 10% of turnover, whichever is the highest. after I leave, Labor comes in and just with a stroke of a pen raises the 10 million to 50 million. So clearly on a roll. The trick though is we need to get the courts to impose those penalties. You know, if Telstra or VW did, because those penalties were both under the old law. Under the new law, you'd like to see them facing a penalty of $1 billion. That I think would change corporate behaviour significantly. Now, in terms of the individual responsibility and the law reform, I may not be aware of what that is. I'm sorry.
Would you like me to read the question?
If you read the last bit out again, I'm sorry.
So do we need more personal actions against the people making the decisions and the implementation of the ALRC systematic liability recommendation?
Yeah. Look, probably. I must say I haven't given it as much thought. I've just been really pushing hard for higher penalties for companies because clearly, you know, we had a penalty against Flight Centre. This was a competition case. I think it was 11.5 million. The business press wrote it up and said, oh, nothing, forget it. No problem. The business press explicitly saying that 11 million was not worth worrying about. Don't worry about it. So I guess my complete focus has been getting the penalties up, both through the courts and getting law change. I've already made the point that the fact that people can go to jail for engaging in cartels has concentrated the mind. So I personally would not have any problems with individuals facing more personal sanction for the decisions they make. But again, it's not an issue I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I urge the project to do that. I'll be more succinct in future. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that talk. I'm Penny Crox from the Faculty of Law, UTS, and I'm very much into holding evil corporations to account in criminal law. And I don't think this is kind of an either or kind of question. Like I do think competition law is incredibly important, but I was thinking when I'm working on stuff on the pharmaceutical industry at the moment, like just basically bad stuff that corporations have done.
Yes.
And a lot of it, I think is partly related to your question before. A lot of it is you could say it's partially caused by competition, you know, the urge to differentiate themselves from the competition falsely, like your Nurofen example is another one, but also Monash IVF is another one that's going on at the moment. And so, yeah, I think competition can kind of be either a catch-all explanation for this kind of wrongdoing, but I'm also thinking, yeah, there should be, I mean, I would go further, not just competition, but also going after them criminally as well. But then the problem is there's that lack of specificity of what offences they could be charged with. Like you think about that with the opioid epidemic, it's actually like they're just faffing around like with nuisance cases, you know, like it's bizarre. So yeah, I guess I'm coming at it from another direction, but not in parallel with you.
Well, look, I certainly think we need stronger laws in relation to those companies, whether they're under the Health Act or something else like that. I couldn't agree more. So I definitely think that's right. You know, when people are misbehaving, though, I mean, describing it as competition, its fault, I think, is a bit strange. I just think we need laws that stop people doing dreadful things, and we need more of those laws.
I think you mentioned that one of the issues is manipulating consumers online. I was just wondering if you could give us a bit more details about that particular issue.
Sorry, I'm not hearing very well. My apologies.
Sorry. You mentioned one of the issues is manipulating customers online. And I was wondering if you could give us a bit more details about these particular issues. At the end of the talk, you were listing various issues, remember? So I was just wondering if you could give us some details, a bit more details about this particular one.
About the problem of consumers online.
Manipulating consumers online?
Yeah. Well, you've got companies that make their money out of manipulating consumers. I mean, that's how they do it. They have to show the companies that are advertising with them that that advertising has an effect. They've got massive amounts of data on you. I know this audience is probably well aware of this, but they're tracking you in every way, every time you're on the internet. They know everything about you. So it's one thing to have advertising in a newspaper that says, go and buy a Mercedes vehicle or a Toyota. It's quite another to be targeted with advertising at a particular time, in a particular way, that gets you when your mood is in a certain way, that can differential price to you, that can take advantage of people at times of vulnerability. I think the amount of data and the advertising and the ability to manipulate consumers is a massive problem that we have to address. Now, different people have different views on it. I'm at one end of being extremely worried about it, getting people to buy things they wouldn't have otherwise, buy them more often. But as I say, take advantage of consumer vulnerabilities. I think it's a real problem. And we desperately need an unfair practices provision if we're going to address that. We have no other law to deal with it.
So the last question is from Rodney Van Royden. He asks, you mentioned Warren Buffett. His business partner, Charlie Munger, talks about incentives leading behaviour, good or bad. I do like your unfair practices legal reform in Australia, but that is a disincentive. Any ideas for incentives for good behaviour at a board level, please, that can filter throughout an organisation?
Look, I think incentives for good behaviour can't come from government or regulators, in my view. I think if regulators start doing it, you get to the risk of regulatory capture. I think it's up to the regulator to come down very hard on misbehaviour, and then it's up to the companies to work out how they avoid their employees doing the wrong thing and getting the company in trouble. That's why I think we've got to have high penalties. We've got to go after the companies and then let the companies sort it out. But let them provide incentives for the behaviour that will keep them out of court, would be my approach.
Thank you, everyone. As you can see, I think there's a real appetite for ongoing further conversations about all of these topics at various levels, from the kind of macro level around the role of capitalism and democracy, all the way through to the kind of micro processes that enable different techniques to achieve different outcomes. And I think really, I mean, that's what we're hoping to achieve in this seminar series over the next year or so. Some of the topics that we already have on really address all of those kinds of questions at different levels and for different within civil and criminal frameworks and across a number of different and emerging industries. So I'm really keen to invite all of you to stay connected with this as it goes forward. There will be at some point in time a webpage available. I think many of you are on a mailing list already, either with UQ or at the University of Sydney. But if you're not, please make your interest known. We'll be sure to keep you informed as this progresses. I think our first proper seminar in this series will take place towards late March, early April. So keep your eye out for that. And I just want to thank you once again for taking the time out, battling your way through traffic valiantly to be here, and really to give us the wealth of knowledge that you've been able to impart and to share with us today, and to start this conversation. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We do have a gift for Rod. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Just some kind of final reflections. I often, when I speak about corporate behaviour, and I've looked at the dishonesty of multinationals like Volkswagen, and reflect on the attitude of culture and their almost rigid requirement to follow rules. If you've ever, it's a stereotype, but I ran a European law centre, and there is always an element of truth to stereotypes. how does a German corporation engage in such systematic dishonesty and choke and poison the cities around the world and continue to lie about it? And it's a really interesting question about how they conceptualize the corporation. In criminal law, they don't actually have the concept of corporate criminal responsibility. And that always kind of triggers, you know, Baron Thurlow in the 18th century, a famous judge who said, you know, corporations have no soul to be damned and no body to be kicked. And it kind of says, well, we can't really punish corporations, which is really the German model, which of course makes them this soulless psychopath. I don't believe that's the case. I think we can hold them to account, and we must, through civil law, through criminal law, and the individuals within it. We have to make them responsible. And so I think this is, sometimes it's presented as either or. It's either regulate, don't regulate, criminalize, don't criminalize, punish or persuade. This is the kind of dichotomy. I always come down to the conclusion that what we need to do is to put all of the regulatory solutions on the table and try and engage in a conversation. That's what we're trying to do here, to evaluate the impact of reforms. Prevention, in my view, is so much better than cure. So education, and that's why I think a large part of what we're trying to do here is a priority. Thank you, Rod, for starting our conversation today. It only leaves me to thank the team, which I would like to thank Rebecca Wallace, and my colleagues from UQ for sharing this opportunity. To Harriet Hollowell, Associate Lecturer at Sydney Law School, for also helping out organising, and Carla Viola and Ashley Joe, Ashley at the back there, who've competently, very competently, as always, looked after us and made sure everything works, because we are academics after all, and without that, very little happens, without the excellent staff that we have. And to thank you, the audience online, we won't forget you. Thank you for joining in. Thank you for your wonderful questions. And as a reward incentive to encourage the conversation, I would like to invite you to partake of some libations at in the foyer out there, and to continue the conversation. So thank you very much.